Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 75, Succession under the Mongols. Before we begin, thank you to new Boyar Christopher. A special thank you to Tsar Mohammed for his continuing generous support. And thank you to new subscribers on Spotify. So, we left off at the death of Alexander, and it might have slipped through unnoticed, but his submission to the Mongols has overturned the Rus succession system. Not entirely, and not straight away. Like other steppe peoples, the Mongols were deeply attached to the idea of a charismatic ruling clan, and they would never attempt to seat any knyaz who was not a Rurikid. But several factors will gradually end the old Rus lateral succession system. First, the determining factor in the succession was now the approval of the Khan, not genealogical seniority. Although the old seniority is not going away immediately because it's still going to be used to provide the candidates for Mongol approval, there will not be knyazes coming forward without a claim. A somewhat related factor is that the Mongols clearly want there to be one person in charge. We've already discussed and seen at length that while the knyaz of Kyiv may have had the most prestige, he was more of a first among equals. He did not rule the other knyazes. The Mongols wanted to give orders to their Grand Knyaz, who would then give orders to all the other knyazes. This was quite a big shift, and to make it happen would require, at the least, Grand Knyazes with the force of personality to assert their authority, and it would also take time for this change to be realized. And while the Mongols allowed for any member of the Golden family to claim the throne, they also had a tendency towards a linear rather than lateral succession. It would take the Rus a while longer to get there, though. For now, Alexander's successor was not immediately clear. Andrey was the next brother, but the Mongols had already supported Alexander against him, and there is the question of whether he was involved in an alliance against the Mongols with Daniel of Galicia. The next brother after him was Yaroslav, who also had some black marks on his record. And since Alexander had died young, in his mid-40s, and his eldest son was still in disgrace following whatever it was that happened in Novgorod, his other children were still too young to try to assert their own claims. Dmitry, who had been made Knyaz of Novgorod and is usually assumed to have replaced Vasily in his father's succession plans, was only in his mid-teens. So Alexander's death left things in the northeast as follows. The Rostov group, Rostov itself, Yaroslavl, Byeloozero and Uglich, were still ruled by Constantine's descendants, now down to his grandsons plus a Fyodor Yaroslavich of Mozhaisk, who had married into the family. Pereyaslav-Zalesky was held by Dmitry Alexandrovich, who was also still Knyaz of Novgorod. Vasily never returns and does not get mentioned again until his death. Where the other children are is passed over, and it's usually assumed that, due to their age, Alexander had not allocated them any domains of their own. In the east, Andrey still held Suzdal, the second biggest domain after Vladimir, which included Gorodets and Nizhny Novgorod. In the west, Yaroslav held Tver. Alexander also had a younger brother, Vasily, who held Kostroma, and his two uncles, Sviatoslav and Ivan, are still with us, although, as I've already said in the previous episode, they make no further contributions to our story. Alexander had not nominated a successor, so, of course, Andrey and Yaroslav both submitted their bids to succeed him to the Mongols. Berke picked Yaroslav. If we believe Tatishev, once again drawing on sources that have since been lost, the Mongols even held an inauguration ceremony for Yaroslav in Sarai. A couple of other knyazes who were also visiting the horde were ordered to lead his horse, and they brought him in full armour, conducted a ceremony of appointment, gave him his yarlik, and appointed a Mongol envoy, Jani Beg, to deal with him. Andrey died the following year, with no mention in the chronicles of how or why. Yaroslav is an example of a knyaz without the force of personality to impose his authority. He rules for 7 years, in which he has so little interaction with most of the other knyazes that there's no mention of them in the chronicles. But historian John Fennell says that this is not the whole story. Besides a lack of character, short reign, and an absence of purpose, he highlights that the contender knyazes lack a sufficiently strong and secure base to operate from as the cause of the general lack of leadership and consolidation we see over the 20 or so years following Alexander. Tver, Kostroma, or Pereyaslavo were not suitable as hometowns for a Grand Knyaz, so the Grand Knyaz could not stay there and develop an independent power base for his family. These towns were also economically and militarily weak compared to Novgorod or Vladimir. Tver had only acquired its first Knyaz 20 years ago, and had only existed for a few decades more than that. Kostroma was even more obscure and does not even appear to have been a knyazhestvo as such at all. If you recall from the last episode, I said that we did not have any evidence for how the other knyazes had been subordinated to Alexander, although it appeared that they were. This situation more or less continues. We assume that there must have been some kind of agreement between Vladimir and Suzdal, at least on the level of mutual military support in the defense of the western borders. But there are no records, no mention in the chronicles of knyazes meeting to settle such matters as we saw in the earlier days. As far as we can tell, the Grand Knyaz's authority amounted to no more than ruling Vladimir, and to whatever authority in Novgorod he could manage to persuade the city to give him. There was no question of the Grand Knyaz interfering in the affairs of any other knyazhestvo, of any authority in civil matters, and no evidence that any of the knyazes paid him any particular attention or obedience. The supposed threat from the west had been quiet through Yaroslav's reign, but in 1269 he decided to mount a new campaign into Estonia, aiming to take Reval. He sent his youngest son, Sviatoslav, to collect troops from Suzdal, and once he had done so, they all assembled at Novgorod. This campaign is notable not so much for any particular military achievements, but because the chronicle notes that the Baskak of Vladimir, one Amragan, went with them. Amragan is the first Baskak to be mentioned in the chronicles. Later, every strategically important town or city will have a Baskak, the official in charge of collecting taxes, suppressing rebellions, and generally keeping order, usually with a force of Mongol or a mixed Mongol and Rus troops under their command. Presumably, Amragan was fulfilling a similar function in Vladimir, and he accompanied the army to monitor the situation for the Khan and advise Yaroslav. Or, some historians argue, because the campaign was initiated and controlled by the Mongols. The following year, we see another step towards growing Mongol involvement, when Novgorod rebels again, and Yaroslav sends the Tisyatsky, Ratibor Kluksovich, to the horde to complain and ask for aid. We heard in the last episode how much trouble Aleksandr Nevsky, a knyaz who, by all accounts, did have the force of personality to impose his authority, had keeping Novgorod in order. Now, weaker Grand Knyazes will allow Novgorod's trend towards greater independence to continue. Throughout the 13th century, and especially over the last 3 or 4 decades, we've seen a struggle to limit the Knyaz's power in Novgorod to military affairs, while the local oligarchy has fought for control over economic and administrative affairs. Authority has come to be shared among the Posadnik, Tisyatsky, Archbishop, and Knyaz. After the census, Alexander's firm hand in suppressing the opposition, the threat of the Mongols, and Mikhail Fyodorovich, the Posadnik and leader of the Great Boyar faction, had made the city peaceful for several years. Once Yaroslav, who was obviously well known in the city, became Grand Knyaz, the boyars of either party had no wish to antagonize him by maintaining their support for Dmitry Alexandrovich. Instead, they threw him out and sent a delegation to Yaroslav to say that Dmitry was too young and they would like Yaroslav to be their knyaz. Yaroslav agreed, and for good measure he married the daughter of one of the boyars. We've had reports of negotiations between the city and the knyaz in the chronicle for a while now, but Yaroslav is the first knyaz for whom his actual contract with the city survives. The contract begins by requiring Yaroslav to kiss the cross for the same terms as his father had done, and since we don't have the previous agreements, this makes it difficult to say what was new. So, for instance, when it states that Yaroslav had to return the meadows that Alexander had taken, we don't know if this is because of some new requirement, or if Alexander had breached his agreement when he took them. The agreement lists the districts, or volosti, of Novgorod, in order to specify that the knyaz is not allowed to interfere in their affairs or the city's. The knyaz is prohibited to confiscate or redistribute land without the approval of the Posadnik. The knyaz is forbidden to take Novgorodians for forced resettlement in the Suzdalian lands, and the knyaz, his wife, and any of his boyars or servitors from any other knyazhestva were barred from owning or controlling lands in any of the Novgorodian volosti. Presumably the knyaz had property of his own in Novgorod itself, because this is stated to be at his sole disposal, although it's not itemized. Yaroslav's men were free to travel throughout the region to collect taxes, and the 2 key fortified towns on the western border, Voloklamsky and Torzhok, were agreed to be jointly administered by representatives of the city and the knyaz. I think we can all agree that this gives the impression that Novgorod is the dominant partner in this agreement, and that the knyaz is being hired to perform certain functions, and not in any way being recognized as ruling the city or being some kind of ultimate authority. Novgorod and Vladimir also had differences of opinion on what to do about Lithuania. When Mindaugas was killed, the son of his nephew, who had been ruling in Polotsk, a young man named Konstantin, fled to Novgorod. Konstantin and his father had been part of that Lithuanian contingent in the campaign against Yuriev in 1262, so he had good contacts in Novgorod and found himself a place advising the boyars on Lithuanian matters. Then, in 1265, as part of the continuing fallout from the Lithuanian Civil War, 300 Lithuanian refugees, all pagans, turned up in Pskov. They were from the factions opposed to Mindaugas, and on Konstantin's advice, the Novgorodians decided the easiest way to deal with the problem was to execute them. Yaroslav disagreed. His son, Sviatoslav, was governing Pskov, and he had him arrange to baptize the Lithuanians and protect them. This seems to have caused a falling out that the chronicle once again doesn't address, but Yaroslav breaks his contract with the city and appoints Andrey's son Yuri as knyaz instead. In 1266, more Lithuanian refugees turn up, this time led by Daumantas, or Dovmont, as the Russians called him. Daumantas had been one of the leaders of the Lithuanian Civil War and had taken part in the murder of Mindaugas, before losing out to Mindaugas' son, Vaishvilkas, in the succession struggle. Daumantas brought his druzhina and household to Pskov, drove out Sviatoslav, converted to Christianity, and set up to reconquer Polotsk, where Vaishvilkas had appointed a vassal named Erden. He launched a first campaign the same year, which defeated Erden and captured his wife, and a second campaign in the winter, for which no details are provided. The Novgorodian boyars entirely supported Daumantas' aims in Polotsk, but Yaroslav, as you might expect, was not happy that Sviatoslav had been kicked out of Pskov. He sent an army through Novgorod to attack Daumantas in Pskov, but the boyars of Novgorod denied them passage, and Yaroslav had to summon them home. The following year, Novgorod sent troops led by a boyar named Yeleferi Zbyslavich to join Daumantas on a campaign against Lithuania. No details are provided for this campaign either, but it's significant that Novgorod is now mounting independent military campaigns without the permission of the knyaz, and, it appears, directly opposed to the knyaz's policies. Generally, it looks like the city had the whip hand. In 1267, they demanded a new contract with Yaroslav, which imposed even more restrictions on the knyaz. He was now expressly banned from taking action against the city in the way that Alexander had done. The list of territories where he could not interfere or own lands was expanded, and further prohibitions on moving populations out of the north were added. Despite Daumantas' requests for more assistance against Lithuania, Novgorod had other priorities. They still had their eyes on Estonia, controlled in the south by the Teutonic Knights and in the north by Denmark, and in particular the port of Reval. A campaign was assembled in 1267, supposedly led by Yuri, but he did not seem to be capable of taking command. Unable to decide on their objectives, the leaders argued for a while before setting off in the general direction of Lithuania. Soon they were arguing again and changed direction to lay siege to Rakavor. The siege went nowhere, and they returned home having achieved nothing. A few months later, they decided to make another attempt. This time, they decided to ignore Yuri and let the Posadnik, Mikhail, make the decisions instead. A large army was assembled, which was intimidating enough for the Teutonic Knights to send messengers to say they would remain neutral, as long as Novgorod was only after Reval. They set out at the beginning of 1268, led by Dmitry Alexandrovich of Pereyaslavo, supported by troops from Tver, Smolensk, and Pskov. Although not in command, Yuri still went with them, as did Dalmantas. Despite the efforts to prepare and gather an impressive army, the campaign did not go well. Rakavor once again withstood their assault. Posadnik Mikhail was killed. Yuri disgraced himself by fleeing the battlefield, and they again went home without achieving anything. This debacle led to a showdown with Yaroslav. He arrived in Novgorod in person and declared, quote, "My men and my brothers and your men have been killed, and you have broken the peace with the Germans." End quote. He accused Eleftheris Bislavich and 2 other boyars of usurping Yuri's authority and causing the trouble, and demanded that their estates be confiscated. The new Posadnik, Pavsha Ananich, defended the boyars, and Yaroslav threatened to abandon the city, which was essentially a threat to go to war. The boyars tried to argue that they were actually in negotiations with the Germans. Yaroslav seems to have lost patience and withdrew from the city. Once again, the boyars and the Grand Knyaz were on the brink of war, and the Archbishop had to intervene to preserve the peace. The boyars agreed to the appointment of Yaroslav's man, Ratibor Kluksovich, as Tisyatsky. A new contract was drawn up, this time with a slightly different tone. Yaroslav was asked to set aside his anger with the city, not to avenge himself, and not to bear a grudge. But at the same time, he was now required to not sit in judgment without the Posadnik, and Novgorodians were not subject to Suzdalian law when they travelled outside their own territory. And Yaroslav and the city continued to disagree over foreign policy. New plans for another campaign against Estonia succeeded before they even began, when the Danes agreed to cede the Narva River to Novgorod. Yaroslav wanted to use the army he had already brought for Estonia to push the Swedes back in Karelia, north of the Neva, but the Novgorodians refused to take part in his campaign, so he ended up just going home. By 1270, crisis point was reached again. A Vecha was called. A majority of the boyars was opposed to Yaroslav. Fights broke out. One of Yaroslav's supporters was killed, and the others barricaded themselves in Gorodische, where Yaroslav had his residence. The Vecha accused Yaroslav of abusing his hunting rights, unlawfully confiscating property, interfering with foreign merchants, and committing violence against the townspeople. They asked him to leave. When he tried to make his case to the Virchi, he was told, quote, "All Novgorod will march against you and chase you out." So he left. Still needing a knyaz, the boyars asked Dmitry Alexandrovich to take over. He was not about to go to war with his uncle, so he refused. Meanwhile, Yaroslav stepped over a line. He sent his man Ratibor to Sarai to ask the Mongols for men to use against Novgorod. The first time a knyaz had asked the Mongols for assistance fighting other Rus. He was unsuccessful for what was probably an unexpected reason. His brother Vasily, who had previously not made any appearance in the political chronicles, sent his own messengers to the Khan to say that the Novgorodians were in the right and the crisis was Yaroslav's fault. Meanwhile, Novgorod was throwing up new fortifications around the city and moving men to forward defense lines. Yaroslav brought up his army with support from Smolensk and Pereyaslav to the Rusa. He sent a messenger to Novgorod to state that all the knyazes were on his side, but he was still willing to give them a hearing. The Novgorodians were not interested. If it had come to a fight, Yaroslav would surely have had overwhelming force, although the most numerous army doesn't always win. But this time, instead of the archbishop intervening, it was Metropolitan Kirill's turn. He sent an emissary from Vladimir with another first. The Metropolitan guaranteed that Yaroslav was sincere in his efforts to make peace, and if the people of Novgorod did not agree, they would be excommunicated. This was the first time, and the only time we know of in the 13th century, that the head of the church had entered politics on behalf of the Grand Knyaz, with what the Middle Ages saw as the ultimate sanction. Like the appeal for Mongol troops, it was a sign of what was to come. The boyars were not willing to risk excommunication, and in the company of two Mongol officials, Yaroslav returned to the throne of Novgorod. The Novgorodians still got the better of the new agreement between them. Their merchants were now given free rein to trade throughout Susdalia, under rules set by the Mongols. All hostages held by Yuri, Yaroslav, or any of Yaroslav's agents were to be returned. This was the final agreement between Yaroslav and Novgorod, and I think the trend has been clear. None of the other knyazes has tried to challenge Yaroslav's right to sit on the throne of Novgorod, but at each new crisis, Yaroslav has only kept his place by new concessions. The opposition to the knyaz has become more unified and more of a majority at each crisis. The support from the greater boyars has faded away. Each new agreement has reduced the knyaz's authority and influence. By now, he can do almost nothing without the posadnik first approving it. Effectively, the boyars now rule the city, and the knyaz is their hired mercenary. Without the Metropolitan and Mengu-Timur's officials, Yaroslav would have had to fight his way into the city. New players were also emerging. Vasily, with his opposition to Yaroslav in Sarai, and Dmitry Alexandrovich in Pereyaslav. Now entering his prime, he was secure in Pereyaslav, and even if he had taken Yaroslav's side, the fact that the boyars had offered him Novgorod showed that he was growing in importance. But as we noted at the beginning of the episode, the Mongols wanted one knyaz to rule the Rus, and they reacted to the first signs of growing tension. All three of these knyazes were summoned to Sarai, Once again, the chronicle covers what happened in silence, and once again, for the third time, the chronicle tells us that the Grand Knyaz died on the way home from the Mongols. Vasily is given the Yarlik and takes the throne of Vladimir in 1271. Almost immediately, Novgorod starts causing trouble again. By now, the chroniclers certainly seem to see Vladimir and Novgorod as tied. At the accession of both Yaroslav and Vasily, the chronicle states that they became Grand Knyaz of Vladimir and Novgorod. Novgorod does not seem to have been consulted over this, and they do not seem to have seen it as automatic. Neither did Dmitry in Pereyaslav. While Vasily was sending his representatives to Novgorod, Dmitry sent his too. Remember that Alexander had appointed Dmitry to Novgorod. He had ruled as his teenaged representative for 5 years, and had later taken part in the successful Yuriev campaign and the less successful Rakovo campaign. So he was a well-known figure in the city. Vasily got off on the wrong foot by telling the people that he was cancelling their contracts with Yaroslav and that he would not be kissing the cross on anything similar. So the boyars chose Dmitry. This time it would come to war. As soon as the news reached Vasily, he seized Torzhok and placed his men in charge. Then he sent his voivoda, a man named Semyon, to ravage the countryside around Novgorod. This had no effect, so he brought in the Mongols. He sent his nephew, Sviatoslav of Tver, with a contingent of his own men and some Mongol troops to attack Voloklamsky, Bezhichi, and Vologda, while Vasily marched directly on Novgorod, accompanied by the Baskak of Vladimir and what the chronicle says was many of the Khan's Tatars. While the armies marched, he also seized all the Novgorodian merchants who were in Vladimir, Tver, and Kostroma to buy grain. Dmitry could not sit out food shortages, so he also had to act. He sent 3 senior boyars to Vasily with his demands: return all captured Novgorod territory, abandon his claim to Novgorod, release all the merchants, and make peace. Vasily was confident in both his military superiority and his superior rights as Grand Knyaz, and rejected all the demands. Dmitry and his Novgorod army marched to attack Tver. However, they only got as far as Torzhok. When they reached Torzhok and Vasily's governor, they decided that they were simply not strong enough to stand against both Vladimir and the Mongols, and they asked Dmitry to leave. After just 3 months, he returned to Pereyaslav. Peace was reached, but nothing was really settled. Vasily made no new demands, no new contract was agreed, but at least there were no new civil wars over the 4 years of Vasily's reign. However, something new was happening. Yaroslav had been the first to call on the Mongols to join a conflict between the knyazes. Vasily had been the first to get them actually involved. Now, the number of Mongols present in the knyazhestva had directly increased. In 1275, the Rus again campaigned against Lithuania, and the Mongols went with them. The campaign was unsuccessful, possibly at least in part because the Mongols ignored the Rus, who were nominally in charge, and ravaged the Rus lands they passed through. Quote, "The Tatars did much wrong and much violence to the Christians as they marched to Lithuania, and on the way back they did still more evil things. They plundered houses, stole horses, cattle, and possessions, and whenever they met anyone, they robbed him and sent him away naked." End quote. This was another first. Mongol troops operating within the knyazhestvo, but not under the control of the knyazes. This, too, is a sign of things to come. In 1275, Vasily was summoned to Sarai. The Khan was unhappy with how little tribute he was receiving. Vasily defended himself by objecting that he collected according to the census. So a new census was ordered. This time, there was no resistance. A year later, Vasily was dead, just 35 years old and with no children. If Aleksandr Nevsky's subsequent reputation stands on his role in saving what would become Russia from the West and the Mongols, we can see no sign of it yet. So far, his legacy is the continuing political decline of the northeastern knyazhestvo into petty domains, and the transition from submission to the Mongols to what the chroniclers would come to call the Mongol oppression. No trace remains of a united Suzdalia. Novgorod continues to move towards oligarchic rule. The descendants of Constantine continue to rule in Rostov, Yaroslavl, Bielozero, and Uglich, with little regard for the Grand Knyaz in Vladimir. Ryazan and Murom to the south paid equally little attention to Vladimir. Pereyaslav, Galich, Moscow, Tver, and Kostroma, held by sons of Alexander and Andrey, all resisted control by Vladimir. The archimandrite of the Monastery of the Caves, Serapion, took refuge in Vladimir during Vasily's rule, and has left us 5 sermons describing the times. Quote, "Thus God released upon us a merciless heathen, a violent people with no mercy for the young, for the weak and aged, or for infants. The wrath of the Lord descended on us. The sacred churches were destroyed. The sacred vessels were defiled. The saints were trampled. The prelate put to the sword. The bodies of the blessed monks were laid out as food for the birds. The blood of our fathers and brothers soaked the earth like water. The strength of our knyazes and commanders disappeared. Our brave warriors were filled with fear and fled. Our brothers and children were led into captivity. Our villages are overgrown with weeds. Our greatness has vanished. Our beauty has perished. Our wealth has been stolen from us. The pagans have inherited our work. The foreigners have taken our land, and our enemies laugh at us." End quote. The last of his surviving sermons looks back on almost 30 years since the Mongols arrived. Quote, "What evils have we not seen in our years? Many burdens and suffering, campaigns, hunger, oppression by the infidels. The pagans who do not follow God's law treat their own kind better than we Christians do. They do not rob or steal from each other. They do not slander each other or sell each other into slavery. They help each other." End quote. You can hear the rhetorical stylizations. Although we do not have vast amounts of text surviving, the Rus are drawing on Byzantine traditions to develop their own literary tradition. We can see several things we've discussed in the episodes previously. Serapion clearly has genuine sympathy and sorrow for the people of Rus. He presents the Mongols as God's punishment for their sins, and he even gives us a list of the ways in which they, mere pagans, are more righteous than the Christian Rus. The suffering caused by the Mongols is described as enslavement, but actual events, the knyaz's submission, the census, Mongol tax collectors, and so on, do not appear. He does not actually refer to Mongols, or Tartars, as his contemporaries would have put it, at all. Only pagans or foreigners. Serapion lived in the residence of Metropolitan Kirill. Kirill was trying to address some problems with canon law. He had requested some books from Bulgaria, and now he worked with Serapion on new rules that would be adopted by the Church at the Council of Vladimir in 1274. Like Serapion's sermons, these rules never mention the Mongols. They state that God has turned his face from the Rus, their cities have been taken, their knyazes have been put to the sword. God's holy churches have been destroyed. Every day they suffer from godless and unclean infidels. Once more, the source of their oppression is only pagans. But whether they're pagans or Mongols, we can see the hostility. So how did the Church reconcile this attitude with their real-world collaboration with the Mongols? As with Aleksandr Nevsky's heroism, our confusion might just come from looking at things the wrong way. As Charles Halperin puts it, Serapion does not face the Mongol conquest in political terms, but in religious and moral ones. It was a commonplace trope in Roman literature since Tacitus to compare the writer's own civilization unfavorably to barbarians. But the aim was to reform that civilization, not to actually praise the barbarians. And as far as the Mongols were concerned, this kind of rhetorical dissent meant nothing if they had political and military submission. The Church was not calling for the overthrow of the Mongols, after all, and the Mongols had so little respect for the opinions of sedentary peoples that they were willing to ignore it. Elsewhere in Rus, as Lithuania recovered from its civil war, it took advantage of Rus' weaknesses to absorb more territory from Polotsk and Volhynia. But for the time being, the Lithuanians were too occupied with the Teutonic Knights to cause much trouble. Back in the northeast, we have a couple of decades left before Moscow and Tver emerge as the new rivals for leadership. And all these trends we have been looking at are going to get worse. The increase in direct Mongol involvement is also going to get worse, due both to the knyazes bringing them into their conflicts and to the Mongols' own internal factors. So join me next episode as we return to the Mongols and look at how the Ulus of Jochi became the Great Horde. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.